garden. And none of the prophets would say anything the king didn't want to hear. Elijah, though, not only dared tell Ahab the truth, he pronounced a judgment for that murder, a devastating drought upon the land. And then Elijah went into hiding. And the kingdom did suffer terribly. But part of the reason for this is that Ahab, who cared nothing about religion except for what it could get him, well, Ahab had not been faithful to God. He'd allowed his wife's religion, his wife Jezebel's religion, to take hold. And so Elijah proposed a contest. He came back, and it was a contest with the prophets of Baal, and the winner would be the one who could burn a sacrifice without using any fire. And the prophets of Baal danced around the sacrifice until they were limp, but they couldn't even make the stones warm. And then, when it was Elijah's turn, he drenched the sacrifice with water, the wood with water, and then was able to draw down from the sky a fire so fierce it even burned the stones up. But he wasn't content with the win. And Elijah ordered the murder of 450 prophets of Baal. And Jezebel was furious and ordered that Elijah be killed in response. So that was a tiny summation of last week. Tiny. Elijah fled, ran and ran and ran until he collapsed under a broom tree, so tired and discouraged, he begged to die. And in response, God sent an angel who served him with bread and water and encouragement. Stay hydrated, the angel said, and get some rest because you have a long journey ahead of you. You're not done. And so he walked for 40 days and 40 nights until he arrived at Mount Horeb. And he entered a cave and he rested that night. And in the morning he heard the voice of God asking, "What are you doing here?" Elijah was immediately defensive. He took it the wrong way. "I've been very zealous. The Israelites have rejected your covenant, and I'm the only one left. And now they're trying to kill me too." And God let him rant. And he quietly said, "No, Elijah, what are you doing here?" And that simple question was a huge, significant transition point for both Elijah and the people. So in 1993, I was called to an inner city church in Cleveland that had plummeted from 1,000 members in its heyday to a few dozen. It was once the largest church in the city and had been determined that it had enough money and people to last 5 more years, 3 years before. And then on the day I was called, 1/3 of that little group left, refusing to be part of a church that was among the first to have an openly gay pastor. Well, the other 2/3 thought that would help the church grow. So there was a lot riding on this. From both inside the church and outside, there was pressure. There were those who hoped we would fail in order to prove their point. And there were those of us who pressured us to be successful to prove their point. Well, it was a time of stress, full of ups and downs, but slowly, and I tell you, ever so slowly, we began to build. And by 1999, I was more than ready to have my first sabbatical. And after a lot of thought about where I should go, I felt God calling me to 2 months in a Benedictine monastery in Santa Fe, outside of Santa Fe. And at the time, I knew almost nothing about monasticism. I had no idea why I was supposed to go there or what I would do, but I said I would go. And before driving onto the grounds, I went a few miles up further the road, and I saw this boulder overlooking the river. And I got out and I sat down on it and I said, "Okay, what am I doing here?" And I received no answer. So I thought, okay, well, let's see. And part of my schedule was meeting with the spiritual director a couple of times a week. And I was apprehensive about this at first because I thought he would assign me a bunch of work to do, like write in a journal for an hour every day. But much to my relief, he simply told me to carry around a little spiral notebook in my pocket and put down any thoughts I had, any words that occurred while I was out hiking or reading or sleeping. My kind of work to do. And a few weeks later, I was walking along the Pecos River, as I did every day, when I heard the question I still ask today. Who am I becoming? That was my Elijah question, a question I never stopped asking and one that continues to evolve as we all do. The same kind of question at the heart of the spiritual life that I ask you today. What are you doing here? Now again, Elijah was immediately defensive and took it the wrong way. Well, what do you mean, what am I doing here? I've been zealous, I've been running, I've been hiding, and I'm the only one left who's faithful. And again, God let him rant, and then quietly said, no, Elijah, what are you doing here? And as he stood there, all of a sudden the earth began to shake. And standing in this cave, the walls began to crumble around him, and rocks coming down and dust rising up, and he runs for the entrance, and outside the wind is roaring like a hurricane. He can barely stand up from the pressure, and then fires explode all around him, you know, the kind that God threw down as Elijah called for it, that had even consumed the rocks. And then quiet. Sheer silence. And a whisper, like a breeze in the back of your neck. Again asked, what are you doing here? Elijah's prophetic life had been marked by spectacle of judgment and confrontation, these violent uprisings against idolatry and corruption. But here, when the silence fell, things shifted. And it became time for Elijah to pass the proverbial torch, but no longer a torch to burn things to the ground. Elijah passed his mantle to a guy he met plowing through the fields, a prophet as different from Elijah as he could be, a man named Elisha. And the torch becomes a touch. It was the power of God known through healing. And let me confess, I couldn't really tell you anything about Elisha off the top of my head. I suspect I'm not alone. We may have heard the name. So I had to study him again this week. And as I did, I was like, oh my God, this guy might be just the kind of prophet we need right now. I'd forgotten that his story begins with him healing poisoned water so that a community had fresh water to drink. And it continues from there. Then he helped a widow save her sons from debt slavery by a miracle that multiplies oil to fill empty jars. And then he listens to the cries of a desperate mother and raises her child from death with his own breath and prayer. And in a foretelling of Jesus, he took loaves of bread sufficient to feed 20 people, and he fed 100 and had leftovers to spare. And next week, you'll hear a story about Elisha welcoming the commander of an enemy army. Not to defeat him, not to humiliate him, not to wipe him out, but to invite him into healing waters, that he might be healed of his disease. You think, why would you do that? Why would you heal a foreign enemy instead of strike back? And that's the kind of moral imagination that shows up in the stories of Elisha. But not just Elisha, not just in Scripture. For example, Ruby Sales. So in 1965, she was a 17-year-old teenager working for the Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee in Alabama, helping to register black voters. And it was dangerous work, and Ruby knew that. Everyone in the movement knew that. And one afternoon, she was walking to a store with a group that included an Episcopal seminarian named Jonathan Daniels. He was in Alabama because he had answered Dr. King's call for people of faith and conscience to come and stand with the people of Selma. And as they approached the store, a deputy sheriff confronted them with a shotgun. In a split second, Jonathan stepped in front of her, and a shot was fired, and he was killed instantly. Ruby survived, but the trauma of that moment stayed with her for years, and she decided to go to seminary, and she later founded the Spirit House Project, which is an organization that combines social justice and spiritual healing. And she said, the most important question we can ask is not, what's wrong with you? Or, why'd you do that? Just the most important question for us to ask is, where does it hurt? And that's how she combines justice and healing. And so again, what are you doing here? As we scroll through the news headlines one after another, it would be easy to become that which angers us. And there is a time for Elijah's fire of truth, to name injustice instead of standing in complicit silence while people suffer, to call out what is outrageous. But with the spirit of Elisha, how about to speak with clarity, a moral imagination that refuses to mirror the cruelty it confronts? Let me say more. To speak with clarity. A voice that's unclouded by vengeance, does not flinch from naming evil, but does not become it. To be angry, how could we not be, but not add to the anger. And to speak not with more volume, but with deeper rootedness. So, to speak with clarity, a moral imagination. That is to not just critique what is, but to dream what could be. You know, that sees a commander of an enemy nation not as a threat, but as a child of God, capable of healing, worthy of compassion. Or that dares to believe that poisoned waters, either by lead and chemicals or lies and deceit, can be made sweet again. That believes a widow's last jar of oil should not be the end of her story. To imagine an economy where no one gets rich off someone else's poverty. To believe trans kids don't need fixing or hiding, but blessing and protection. To dare dream of lawmakers led by compassion, not cruelty, who can see beyond party lines and ask, who's hurting? What can we do? To speak with clarity, a moral imagination that refuses to mirror the cruelty it confronts. That continues to ask, who am I becoming? Because if we become what we oppose, we've already lost the gospel. Elisha didn't inherit Elijah's rage. He inherited his call and transformed it from calling down fire to building up life. The cruelty we confront is real. So is our sacred courage to respond without replicating it, right? You with me? To confront evil, but not with more evil, rather a relentless mercy that disrupts the cycle. And might I suggest you are here because you believe in the fire of truth, but not the fire of destruction. Because you know that mercy is not weak, and that hope is not naive, and that love, fierce and resilient and radical love, is still the most powerful thing we can offer this weary world, and the only thing that can heal us. And you also know we're far from done. Oh my gosh, we're not even close. Not even close to resolving the mess that keeps getting worse. So what do we need to do? We need to stay hydrated. Jesus offers this thing called living water. And to get some rest. Because as the angel said, the journey's long, but the call? Oh, the call is crystal clear. And so I ask again, what are you doing here today?